The first thing they noticed was the wheelchair. Not her name, not the folder in her lap, not the quiet strength in her hands. Just the wheelchair.
Deliveries use the side entrance.
At the front desk, Marissa Vale smiled as if kindness was optional.
I am not making a delivery.
Then she suggested charity services, assistance programs, and the wrong building.
If this is about charity services, you are in the wrong building.
Lillian Voss did not shout. She did not beg. She reached into her folder and placed an old brass badge on the counter. It said co-founder. Marissa Vale laughed anyway. Then she picked up the badge and held it just out of reach.
Give it back.
Dispatch, this is Unit 2. I have a situation at the lobby desk. Suspect matching description is present.
I need Mr. Cho downstairs now.
Minutes later, Daniel Cho came running from the elevator, breathless and pale, shouting the words that cracked the whole lobby open.
Mrs. Voss.
The receptionist looked at the woman in the wheelchair and smiled as if kindness had been replaced with policy. It was 8:42 on a rainy Thursday morning in downtown Atlanta. The lobby of Voss Meridian Health Systems smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. People in pressed suits moved through security without being stopped. At the counter, Lillian Voss waited with both hands folded over a brown leather folder. Her navy cardigan was plain. Her blouse had a rain spot near the collar. A folded umbrella rested across her knees. Pain burned through her left hip, but her back stayed straight. The receptionist glanced at her once. "Mom, deliveries use the side entrance." Lillian lifted her eyes. "I'm not making a delivery." "Then do you have an appointment?" "Yes, with Daniel Cho." The receptionist's nameplate read Marissa Vale. "Mr. Cho doesn't take walk-ins." "I'm not a walk-in." "Do you have a confirmation email?" "I was told I would be expected." Marissa gave a small laugh, the kind meant to sound professional while cutting deep. Everyone says that. Behind Lillian, a man near the coffee stands slowed down. Near the glass doors, security guard Isaiah Reed turned his head. Marissa typed, then shook her head. "I don't see your name. Please call his office." "Mom, this is private headquarters. We can't just let anyone ask for executives." The lobby carried every word. Lillian had heard that tone before. In hospital hallways, at counters where people asked for ID twice. "I came for a scheduled meeting," she said. Marissa looked over Lillian's wheelchair, old folder, and scuffed shoes. "If this is about billing, assistance programs, or charity services,
You're in the wrong building.
A silence opened, just wide enough for Lillian to feel strangers deciding whether to look away. "I didn't come for charity," she said. "Then what did you come for?" Lillian glanced toward the elevators. Silver doors opened and closed, carrying people upward into a company that had once known her name. "I came to see what happened to this place." Marissa laughed. "With respect," Marissa said, "this is one of the most respected medical service companies in the Southeast." "With respect," Lillian answered, "I know where I am." Something in her voice made Isaiah step away from the door. Marissa's smile tightened. "You can't stay here blocking. Reception." Lillian looked to both sides of her wheelchair. There was open marble everywhere. Still, she moved back an inch. Not because Marissa was right, but because some people only need an excuse. Then Lillian opened the brown leather folder. Inside were a sealed envelope, a worn photograph, and a small brass name badge. She touched the badge before lifting it, then placed on the counter. The badge was old. No barcode, no chip, just faded engraved letters. Lillian Voss, co-founder. For the first time, Marissa did not speak right away. Then she pushed the badge with one finger. "Where did you get this?" "It was given to me." "By whom?" "My husband." "And who was your husband?" The question was careless enough to wound. Lillian's eyes changed, just briefly. "Ella Voss." The name should have meant something in that building. Once, new hires heard how Eli and Lillian began the company above a laundromat with 2 folding chairs and 1 handwritten rule on the wall. Never make people beg to be seen. Now the rule was gone, and Lillian was being treated like she had wandered into the wrong life. Marissa picked up the badge. "We don't accept old souvenirs as identification." Lillian's hand went still. "Please give it back. I need to verify it." "You won't verify it by disrespecting it." Isaiah was closer now. His eyes were fixed on the badge. When Marissa turned it over, he saw the engraving on the back, EV to LV, 1998. His breath caught. He had seen those initials in an old photographs near the staff corridor. Before the glass, before the money. Before the door forgot who built the room. Isaiah reached for his radio. Marissa snapped. "What are you doing?" He pressed the button. "Front lobby to executive floor," he said low and urgent. "I need Mr. Cho downstairs now." Marissa froze. Lillian closed her folder, and somewhere above them, Daniel Cho heard the message, understood the name, and started running, 3 hours before Isaiah called Daniel Cho downstairs. Lillian Voss sat at her kitchen table and watched rain crawl down the window glass. Her apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the soft tick of the wall clock above the stove. On the table lay 2 pills, a cup of tea gone lukewarm, and the brown leather folder she had not opened since dawn. She had dressed slowly. First the cream blouse, then the navy cardigan, then the pearl earrings Eli had bought from a sidewalk vendor because he said real beauty did not need a glass case. The wheelchair waited beside the bed. Some mornings she looked at it like a tool. Other mornings, like a verdict. This morning, she looked at it like transportation. Her left hip ached where surgery had left a storm under the skin. The accident happened 6 years earlier, 2 months after Eli's funeral. People called it a tragedy, stacked on a tragedy, as if pain became easier when named properly. It did not. After the funeral, Lillian stopped visiting Voss Meridian. At first, everyone understood. Then months became years. The board sent reports. Daniel called every quarter. Lawyers carried documents to her apartment. Her signature still mattered, but her presence faded into rumor. Some employees thought she was ill. Some thought she had sold her shares. Some did not know she existed. But inside the folder was proof that absence is not always surrender. The first letter arrived in March with no return address. "Mrs. Voss," it began, "I do not know if anyone will let this reach you, but your husband said this company was built for people who were tired of being ignored." Lillian had read that sentence 5 times. The letters kept coming. One described a janitor written up for sitting during a dizzy spell. One described a patient's daughter being spoken to like trouble because she asked too many questions. One described front desk staff being trained to protect the company image, though no one would put that phrase in a manual. At the bottom of the last packet was one typed line. "Please come before they make kindness look unprofessional." Now she opened the folder again. The sealed envelope was on top, addressed to Daniel Cho. Beneath it was the worn photograph of her and Eli outside their first office. The sign behind them had been crooked. Eli's tie had been too wide. Lillian was holding a paper cup and laughing with her whole face. She touched the photograph. "We were brave then," she whispered. "In 1998, no investor wanted to hear from a black woman with careful spreadsheets and a soft voice. They wanted Eli's charm, Eli's handshake, Eli's big laugh filling a room. But every invoice, patient list, hiring note, and late-night call had passed through Lillian's hands. When the first partnership agreement was written, Eli slid it across their kitchen table and tapped one number, 51%. Lillian had stared at him. "Ellie, no. Yes, you're the one they listen to. And you're the reason there's something worth listening to." He had taken the brass badge from his pocket and pinned it to her blouse, co-founder. Never let them make you a footnote, he told her. Years later, she had almost done it to herself. At 8:05, the transportation van honked downstairs. Lillian placed the photograph and badge into the folder, then paused over the sealed envelope. Inside were complaint summaries, her voting notice, and one sentence she had written by hand. I am coming to listen before I decide what must change. She did not come wearing diamonds. She did not call ahead with lawyers. She did not ask Daniel to meet her at the door. She wanted to see the company before it knew it was being watched. As the van carried her through wet streets, Atlanta blurred beyond the window. The city was full of people trying to arrive with dignity intact. If you have ever watched someone be judged before they were understood, stay with this story and tell me in the comments who taught you not to look away. At 8:39, the van stopped outside the glass tower with Eli's name still carved above the entrance. Lillian looked up at it for a long moment. Then she placed one hand on the folder and whispered, "Let me see what they have done, what we built." 3 minutes later, Marissa Vale would mistake her quietness for weakness. And by the time Daniel Cho heard Zizea's call, the first crack in the polished lobby had already opened. On the 22nd floor, Voss Meridian looked nothing like the company in Lillian's photograph. There were no crooked signs, no folding chairs, no coffee cups balanced beside stacks of unpaid invoices. Everything was glass now, glass walls, glass conference rooms, glass doors that made every private conversation look clean from the outside side. At 8:31 that morning, Naomi Brooks stood beside the copy machine with a stack of reports pressed against her chest. She had been awake since 4:10, not because she wanted to be early, but because fear had its own schedule. Naomi was a junior HR analyst, which meant she saw enough to feel responsible and had too little authority to be believed. Her desk was near the complaints database. She knew which reports were answered, which were delayed, and which ones disappeared after being renamed as attitude conflicts or customer misunderstandings. That was how harms you saw in polite buildings. It learned better words. 2 weeks earlier, Naomi had printed 23 employee complaints and mailed them to Lillian Voss with no signature. She had written the final herself. Please, come before they make kindness look unprofessional. Now Lillian was supposed to arrive today. Naomi did not know what the woman looked like. She had only found an old archive photo from 1998 with Lillian standing beside Eli in front of a cheap cardboard sign. In the photo, Lillian's smile had looked fearless. Naomi wondered what time did to a fearless smile. The copy machine clicked and breathed warm paper into the tray. Naomi looked over her shoulder before slipping one extra packet into her tote bag. From down the hall, Clara Whitmore's voice cut through the morning. Perception is policy, whether people like it or not. Naomi froze. Clara was walking with Daniel Cho and 2 department heads. Her ivory blazer looked untouched by the rain outside. Her hair was pulled into a smooth bun, not one strand out of place. Daniel looked tired. Clara looked certain. "We have investors visiting next month," Clara said. "The front lobby is not a shelter. It is the first expression of our standard." Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone. There have been concerns about how that standard is being applied. "There are always concerns," Clara replied. "Weak managers call them complaints. Strong managers call them alignment issues." Naomi lowered her eyes. She had heard that phrase before Einland issue. It appeared on 3 reports after cleaning staff said they were spoken to like they were invisible. It appeared after a receptionist mocked a courier's accent. It appeared after an older patient's son was told to lower his voice when all he had done was ask where to find a restroom. The words changed. The wound stayed the same. Near the service elevator, Tacha Bell pushed a cart of folded towels and cleaning spray. Her green work polo was faded at the collar. She moved slowly because one wheel on the cart always pulled left. Tasha glanced at Naomi, then at Clara. Neither woman spoke. They did not have to. Some workplaces teach people a second language made of small looks. Clara stopped outside the executive conference room. Daniel, if Mrs. Voss does appear today, keep the meeting contained. She has been absent for years. Sentiment should not disrupt operations. Daniel's jaw tightened. She owns the majority and has chosen not to use it. Naomi's fingers tightened around the reports. That was the thing powerful people often misunderstood. Quiet did not always mean permission. Sometimes quiet meant someone was gathering the strength to open the door. Downstairs in the lobbies, Lillian had already opened the brown folder. Marissa Vale did not know any of this. She did not know about Naomi's letters. She did not know about Tasha's incident notes tucked inside an old lunch bag in the cleaning closet. She did not know that Daniel had spent the previous night reading a legal notice with Lillian's signature at the bottom. Marissa only knew what Clara had made valuable: control the lobby, protect the image, keep certain kinds of trouble from reaching upstairs. And Marissa was good at that. Too good. She had spent years learning how to look polished enough to be safe. She had grown up in apartment offices where women behind desks decided whether her mother could have 3 more days to pay rent. She remembered the shame of being judged by shoes, by zip code, by the nervous way her mother explained herself. Marissa hated that memory, so she built a new one. A sharp blazer, a bright nameplate, a voice that sounded expensive, a desk between herself and anyone who reminded her of the life she had outrun. That was her contradiction. She had once been wounded by doors, and now she guarded one. At 8:44, Naomi stepped into the hallway and saw Daniel's phone light up. He looked down, his face changed, not slowly, all at once. Then Isaiah's voice came through the building. Radio clipped to a nearby security supervisor, front lobby to executive floor. "I need Mr. Cho downstairs now." Daniel turned toward the elevators. Clara caught his arm. "What is it?" Daniel pulled away. "Lillian Voss is downstairs." Clara's expression remained still, but her eyes sharpened. Alone, Daniel was already walking faster. Naomi followed without thinking. Tasha out from beside surface elevator, one hand still on the cart. For a moment, the whole 22nd floor seemed to hold its breath, because if Lillian Voss had come through the front door alone, then the building had already shown her who it had become. Daniel reached the elevator and pressed the button hard enough to make his knuckle pale. The doors opened. He stepped inside. Naomi saw Clara move behind him, no longer graceful, no longer slow. And as the doors began to close, Daniel said the words that made Naomi's stomach drop. "If Marissa stopped her at that desk, we may already be too late." In the lobby, Marissa Vale still held the brass badge between 2 fingers. She did not know a man was running toward the elevator above her. She did not know Naomi Brooks had gone pale on the 22nd floor. She only knew that a security guard had called upstairs without her permission, and that the woman in the wheelchair had become more trouble than she was worth. "Isaiah," Marissa said, keeping her smile in place. "You need to cancel that request." Isaiah lowered the radio but did not move away. "I think Mr. Cho should come down. I think you should return to your post." There it was, not anger, authority. Marissa knew how to use authority like a clean knife. No shouting, no ugly words. Just enough pressure to remind everyone who was allowed to decide what mattered. Lillian looked at the badge in Marissa's hand. "My badge," she said. Marissa's smile thinned. "Mum, if this badge is legitimate, then Mr. Cho can verify it. And if it is not, then we'll have to ask why you brought false company identification into a restricted building." A few people nearby stopped pretending. The man by the coffee stand turned fully now, A woman in red heels paused near the security ropes. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Lillian heard the whisper and felt old heat rise in her chest. Not shame, merit. She remembered sitting in a county office, 1979, while a clerk spoke over her to Eli, though she was the one holding every document. She remembered a bank manager praising Eli's business instincts, while ignoring the ledger Lillian had prepared by hand. She remembered hospital staff asking if she understood her own treatment plan after the accident, as if pain had taken her intelligence too. People could look directly at you and still refuse to see you. That was a lesson no school had taught her. Life had. "Marissa," Isaiah said quietly. "Give the lady her badge back." Marissa turned toward him. "Do not tell me how to run my desk. It isn't your desk if it makes people smaller." The lobby went still in pieces. First the woman in red heels, then the young man with the coffee, then a delivery driver near the revolving doors. Marissa's cheeks flushed. "Excuse me?" Isaiah did not raise his voice. "I said's what I said." For a moment, Lillian looked at him with something close to gratitude, but also worry. She knew what it cost a working person to speak in a building like this. Courage was not free when rent was due. Marissa reached for the desk phone. "I'm calling building security." "You are building reception," Isaiah said. "I am building security." That landed harder than he expected. A nervous laugh broke from someone near the elevators, then died quickly. Marissa stood. She was not tall, but the counter gave her height. Her blazer was sharp, her hair perfect, her silver nameplate shining under the lobby lights. "Mrs. Voss," she said, making the name sound like a costume. "Until your identity is confirmed, I need you to move away from the front desk." Lillian extended one hand. "My badge first." Marissa held it just out of reach. "Move away." The wheelchair's front wheels shifted slightly as Lillian leaned forward. The movement sent pain through her hip, sharp enough to make her breath catch. She covered it by closing her hand around the edge of the counter. Marissa saw the pain and mistook it for weakness. "Do you need assistance moving?" she asked. The words were polished. The cruelty was not. Something changed in Lillian's face. Not dramatically, not loudly, but her softness closed around something harder. "No," Lillian said. "I need respect," the elevator chimed. No one noticed at first, because the revolving doors opened at the same time, Sam, letting in another gust of rain and traffic. Then footsteps struck the marble fast. Daniel Cho came out of the elevator nearly breathless, his tie crooked, his phone still in his hand. Behind him came Clara Whitmore, controlled but moving quickly. Naomi was half a step behind, clutching papers to her chest. Tasha Bell appeared near the service hallway, silent and watchful. Daniel saw Toe Keelchair first, then Lillian's face, then the brass badge in Marissa's hand. His expression broke. "Mrs. Voss." Marissa turned, the color drained from her cheeks. Daniel crossed the lobby so quickly that two employees stepped back. "Give her the badge," he said. Marissa blinked. "Mr. Cho, I was just verifying." "Give it to her now." The manager's voice cracked through the polished lobby. Marissa placed the badge on the counter. Lillian picked it up slowly, rubbing her thumb once over the scratched brass as if checking whether it still remembered her. Daniel stopped in front of her. "I am so sorry," he said. Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "Are you sorry because it happened?" she asked. "Or because I was the one it happened to?" No one moved. That question entered the lobby, like a key turning in a locked door. Daniel swallowed. Before he could answer, Marissa tried to recover. "Mr. Cho, I had no way of knowing who she was." Daniel turned to her, eyes wide with disbelief. "That is exactly the problem." Marissa's mouth opened, then closed. Clara stepped forward smoothly. "Mrs. Voss, perhaps we should continue this conversation upstairs in private." Lillian did not look at Clara. Her eyes stayed on Daniel. "No," she said. "This started in public. A soft murmur passed through the lobby. Lillian placed the badge back into her folder, then looked around at the faces watching her. Some guilty, some curious, some relieved that power had finally chosen a side. Then Daniel said the words Marissa would remember for the rest of her life. Everyone, please understand. Mrs. Lillian Voss is not a visitor. She is not a patient. She is not asking for charity. His voice trembled once, then steadied. She owns 51% of this company. The lobby did not explode. It emptied of sound. Marissa gripped the edge of the counter. Isaiah lowered his eyes. Naomi's papers shook in her hands. And Lillian, who had been made to wait like an inconvenience in the company she helped build, looked up at the glass tower above her and said quietly, "Then let us see what my company has become." They took the private elevator to the 22nd floor, but nothing about that ride felt private. Daniel stood beside Lillian's wheelchair with one hand near the control panel, not touching her chair, not daring to act familiar. Clara stood across from them, calm enough to look innocent. Naomi held her papers against her chest so tightly the corners bent. Isaiah came too, at Lillian's request. Marissa was not invited, but she followed anyway, 2 steps behind Clara, her face pale beneath the lobby lights. No one spoke until the doors closed. Then Clara said, "Mrs. Voss, I want to apologize for the confusion downstairs." Lillian turned her head. "Confusion?" Clara's mouth paused on the next word. Daniel looked at the floor. Lillian's voice stayed soft. "I was not confused. Miss Vale was not confused. The people watching were not confused. A woman in a wheelchair was treated as if she did not belong. Let us not give cruelty a cleaner name." Naomi looked up. For years, she had watched people in that building polish harm until it sounded like policy. Misunderstanding, miscommunication, alignment issue, guest management, brand protection. But Lillian had stripped the words down to what they were. The elevator opened onto glass walls and quiet carpet. The executive floor smelled colder than the lobby, like paper, air conditioning, and expensive flowers kept too long in a vase. Framed awards lined the hall. In one silver frame, Eli Voss smiled beside a governor from 15 years ago. Lillian looked at the photograph but did not stop. Daniel led them into the boardroom. It was a long room with a black table, 12 leather chairs, and a wall of windows looking over the wet city. Rain moved across the glass in thin silver lines. Clara took her usual seat near the head of the table. Lillian did not move toward the head. She stopped beside the middle chair and placed her brown folder on the table. "Who has access to lobby footage?" she asked. Daniel blinked. "Security and operations." "Good. I want today's footage preserved." "Of course, and the footage from the last 6 months." The room changed, not loudly, but every face adjusted. Clara folded her hands. 6 months is a broad request. So was what I saw downstairs. Marissa swallowed. "Mrs. Voss, I truly did not know who you were." Lillian looked at her then. "That is not the defense you believe it is." Marissa's eyes shone, but no tears fell. Lillian continued, "If you had known I owned the company, you would have treated me differently. That means your respect was waiting for proof of power." Isa lowered his gaze, as if the truth had weight. Daniel cleared his throat. "We can review front desk training and make adjustments." "No," Lillian said. Just one word. Daniel stopped. "No adjustments before truth. No training before evidence. No apology before understanding what has been allowed here." Clara leaned back slightly. "With respect, Mrs. Voss, we should be careful not to turn an unfortunate lobby incident into a company-wide accusation." Lillian opened the folder. The first packet she removed was thick, clipped at the corner, covered in neat yellow tabs. Naomi's breath caught. Lillian noticed, but did not look at her yet. "I received letters," Lillian said, "anonymous at first, then copies of reports, then names." Daniel's face tightened. Clara's expression did not change, which told Lillian more than surprise would have. One employee wrote that a cleaning supervisor was told not to sit in public areas because it looked unprofessional. One wrote that a visitor using a cane was asked to wait outside until her appointment was confirmed. One wrote that complaints about front desk conduct were reclassified as attitude conflicts. Tasha Bell stood near the doorway, her hands folded in front of her work jacket. At the word cleaning supervisor, her chin lifted. Clara turned toward Daniel. Were these verified? Lillian answered before Daniel could. That is why I am here. She placed another paper on the table. My voting notice, my ownership authority, my request for an immediate internal dignity review. The words dignity review seemed to bother Clara more than ownership authority. Marissa spoke carefully. I follow the standards I was given. Lillian looked at her. Who gave them to you? The question landed at the center of the table. Marissa glanced at Clara. It was quick, too quick, but everyone saw it. Clara's face remained composed. We have visitor protocols, she said. Protocols do not teach a person to laugh at someone's clothes, Lillian replied. Protocols do not teach a person to hold a keepsake out of reach. Protocols do not teach a person that a wheelchair is evidence of inconvenience. The room fell quiet. Rain tapped the window. Naomi looked down at the papers in her arms. Her hands trembled once. She had imagined this moment so many times, but imagination had not included the fear of standing in it. Lillian turned toward her. You are Naomi Brooks. Naomi froze. Yes, Mom. You sent the letters. Daniel turned. Clara's eyes sharpened. Naomi's face went small with fear. Lillian's expression softened. Thank you. 2 words. Naomi pressed her lips together. No one had thanked her for telling the truth before. Mostly, truth had cost her sleep. Clara said, Mrs. Voss, anonymous document handling is a serious breach. Lillian did not raise her voice. So is burying pain because it arrives without a title. Then she looked at Daniel. I want the footage. I want the original complaints. I want every reclassified report involving reception, security, patient access, facilities, and visitor services. Daniel nodded slowly. And after that, Clara asked. Lillian placed the brass badge on the table. Its old metal looked almost humble against the polished black surface. After that, Lillian said, we find out whether this company still deserves the name on the building. No one answered, because behind her, through the glass wall, employees had begun gathering in the hallway. Not close enough to interrupt, close enough to witness. And for the first time in years, the truth inside Voss Meridian was no longer traveling by whisper. Marissa Vale had spent 12 years learning how to never look poor again. She learned it in department store mirrors, turning sale rack blazers into armor. She learned it from women who smiled at her mother only after checking the balance due. She learned it from apartment managers who spoke slowly, as if overdue rent also meant overdue intelligence. By 34, she had built a version of herself that no one could dismiss quickly. Perfect hair, clean nails, controlled voice, a desk with her name on it. But fear has a strange way of surviving success. Sometimes it simply changes close. Now she sat at the far end of the boardroom, hands clasped under the table so nobody could see them shaking. Across from her, Lillian Voss watched the room with quiet patience. Daniel had sent for the original complaint logs. Naomi had been asked to stay. Isaiah stood near the door. Tasha Bell had not entered fully, but she had not left either. Clara Whitmore remained smooth as glass. Miss Vale, Lillian said, tell me what you were trained to do when someone arrived without digital confirmation. Marissa swallowed. Ask for identification. Confirm the appointment. Protect restricted floors. That sounds reasonable. Marissa looked relieved for half a breath. Then Lillian added, now tell me what you were trained to assume. No answer came. Daniel shifted in his chair. Lillian waited. People often rushed silence because they feared what it might reveal. Lillian had learned not to rush it. Finally, Marissa said, "We were told the lobby sets expectations." Whose expectations? Visitors, investors, partners. And what kind of person was considered a risk to those expectations? Marissa looked toward Clara again. Clara's voice was calm. "This is becoming unnecessarily personal. It became personal when my wheelchair was treated like evidence against me," Lillian said. Naomi looked down, breathing carefully. Marissa's mouth tightened. "Mrs. Voss, I made a mistake, but I was trying to do my job." "No," Tasha said from the doorway. Every head turned. Tasha stepped inside with the slow close of someone crossing a line she could not uncross. "No."
You were not just doing your job?
Marissa's eyes flashed. "Excuse me." Tasha looked at Lillian, then back at Marissa. "Last October, my sister came here to drop off my lunch because I forgot it on the kitchen counter. She had on her home health aide uniform. You told her service deliveries went around back." Marissa blinked. Tasha continued. "She said she was family. You told her families did not wander through corporate reception. Then you called me downstairs in front of 2 supervisors, like I had done something shameful." The room changed again. Not with shock, with recognition. That was worse, because recognition meant this was not new. Marissa's face reddened. "I don't remember that. My sister does." Tasha reached into the canvas lunch bag hanging from her shoulder. From inside, she pulled folded papers, worn at the creases. "I wrote it down because official reports have a way of getting lost in this building." Daniel closed his eyes. Clara's jaw tightened for the first time. Lillian looked at the lunch bag, then at Tasha. "May I?" Tasha brought the papers forward. Her hands were rough from chemicals and winter air. Lillian received the notes with both hands, the way some people receives something sacred. The first page listed dates, times, names, short descriptions, no drama, no exaggeration. Just harm recorded by someone who had learned that memory needed witnesses. Isaiah spoke next. There were complaints from visitors, too. Daniel turned to him. "You saw them?" "I saw some of what caused them." His voice was low. "I should have said more." Lillian looked at him gently. "Why didn't you?" Isaiah's eyes stayed on the carpet. "Because men with hourly wages learn the shape of risk." "No one," corrected him. Marissa's shoulders dropped. For the first time, the polished edge of her cracked. "You all think I enjoyed it," she said. "You think I woke up wanting to hurt people." Lillian did not answer quickly. "I think," she said, "you learned that being close to power felt safer than being close to pain." Marissa's eyes filled. That sentence found the part of her she had hidden behind perfume and policy. "My mother was humiliated everywhere we went," Marissa whispered. "Every office, every counter, every waiting room. People looked at us like we were asking for too much just by standing there." "And so you decided never to be the woman at the counter," Lillian said. Marissa looked down. "You became the counter." The words were not loud, but they reached everyone. Marissa wiped one tear quickly. Angry that it had escaped, Clara sat forward. "This is moving far beyond operational review." Lillian turned to her. "No, we are finally reaching it." Daniel's assistant entered with a tablet and a printed access report. Daniel read the first page, and his face hardened. "What is it?" Lillian asked. He looked at Clara. Several complaints were edited after submission. Naomi's breath caught, Daniel continued. Original wording was changed before review. Mentions of disability, race, age, and class-based assumptions were removed and replaced with customer tone issue or lobby disruption. Marissa stared at Clara. "I didn't do that." "No," Naomi said quietly. Reception did not have access. The room slowly turned toward Clara. Clara remained still, but the glass around her had begun to show a crack. Lillian placed Tasha's notes beside Naomi's packet and the old brass badge. 3 kinds of evidence: mirror, records legacy. Then she looked at Clara Whitmore and asked, "Who taught my company to hide the truth by renaming it?" For once, Clara did not answer right away. Outside the boardroom, more employees had gathered behind the glass wall, their faces blurred by reflection, their silence heavier than any accusation. And Marissa Vale, who had spent years guarding the door, realized the person she most needed protection from had never been Lillian. It was the woman who taught her which people to keep out. Clara Whitmore had built her career by never appearing cornered. Even now, with employee faces gathered behind the glass wall and complaint records spread across the boardroom table, she sat with her shoulders straight and her hands folded as if the meeting were still under her control. "Mrs. Voss," Clara said, "edited reports are not always evidence of concealment. Sometimes language is adjusted for legal clarity." Lillian looked at the papers. "Legal clarity," she repeated. Daniel's face tightened. Naomi stared at the table as if she could still see every sentence that had been erased. Tasha stood near the door, arms crossed, no longer hiding behind politeness. Lillian lifted one complaint. A visitor wrote, "I was treated like I was dangerous because I asked for wheelchair access." She placed it down. The edited version says, "Visitor became frustrated about building entry." She lifted another. An employee wrote, "My supervisor told me my accent made the lobby feel less professional." She placed it beside the first. The edited version says, "Employee resisted communication coaching." Then she looked at Clara. "That is not clarity. That is laundering." No one spoke. Rain moved down the windows behind them, blurring the city into gray light. Clara inhaled slowly. "You have been away a long time. You may not understand the pressures of running a company at this scale." Lillian's expression did not change. "I understand scale. With respect, sentiment cannot govern an institution." Lillian reached into her folder. This time she did not remove a report. She removed the worn photograph. The old image looked small on the long black table. In it, Eli Voss stood outside the first office with a crooked tie and a smile too large for the struggling business behind him. Beside him, Lillian stood younger, slimmer, laughing with a paper cup in her hand and a brass badge pinned to her blouse. Daniel looked away. He remembered that photograph. It used to hang beside the staff entrance, where new hires passed it every morning. Years ago, Clara had moved it to the archives during a brand modernization project. Daniel had approved the change because it seemed minor then. He saw now that some erasures begin as decorations being moved. Lillian placed the brass badge beside the photograph. "This company began at a kitchen table," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. "Before there were investors, there were bills we could barely pay. Before there were awards, there were patients calling after hours because they did not know which form would keep their care from being interrupted. Before there was a lobby, there was Eli driving across town in the rain because one woman said no one at her insurance office had listened to her all week." Her hand rested near the badge. "And before anyone called him a visionary. He asked me to check every number because he knew good intentions, without discipline, could still hurt people." The room softened around the edges. Even Marissa looked at the photograph as if she were seeing the company for the first time. Lillian continued. "The first rule we wrote was not about profit. It was not about image. It was not about making powerful people comfortable when they walked through the door." She looked toward the glass wall where employees stood in silence. The rule was this: never make people beg to be seen. Naomi pressed her fingers to her mouth. Tasha lowered her eyes. Isaiah stood straighter. Clara's jaw hardened. "That is a beautiful memory," Clara said. "But memory does not pay salaries." "No," Lillian said. "People do." The sentence landed cleanly. "People pay salaries. People answer phones. People clean rooms. People calm frightened families. People carry this company on backs you have decided not to notice. Daniel looked at Clara, then at Lillian. I knew some reports were being softened, he said. Clara turned sharply. Daniel swallowed, but did not stop. I told myself it was legal review. I told myself every company does it. I told myself if I pushed too hard, I would lose influence, and then I could help no one. Lillian watched him with sadness, not surprise. And did silence help them? Daniel shook his head. No. Clara's voice cooled. Daniel, be careful. He looked at her. I should have been careful when employees trusted us with the truth. Behind the glass, someone began to cry quietly. Someone else took their hand. Marissa wiped her face again, no longer trying to hide it well. Lillian turned to her. Miss Vale, you harmed me today. You harmed others before me. That will not be excused. Marissa nodded once, small and broken. But I also see that you were rewarded for becoming hard in the exact places. This company should have taught you to be human. Marissa's face crumpled, but she held herself together. Then Lillian looked back at Clara. You were not confused by the culture. You designed it. Clara stood. I designed a company that survived. You designed a company that forgot why survival mattered. For the first time, Clara's composure cracked enough to show anger. You think kindness scales? You think dignity survives quarterly pressure, investor calls, lawsuits, audits, expansion, public scrutiny? Lillian's answer came without force. It survives if the people in charge refuse to sell it first. The room went completely still. Daniel placed the access report in front of Lillian. These are the audit logs, he said. They show who approved these edits. Clara did not look at the report. She looked at Lillian. For 1 second, all the polished language fell away. And what remained was not a villain from a storybook, but a woman who had mistaken control for strength. For so long, she no longer knew what honesty would cost her. Lillian opened the report. Naomi stopped breathing. Tasha gripped the strap of her lunch bag. Isaza lowered his radio. And as Lillian read the first name on the approval list, the boardroom door opened. 3 board members stepped inside, summoned by Clara before the elevator ever reached the floor. They looked at the papers, the employees behind the glass, the brass badge, and finally at Lillian. The oldest board member cleared his throat. Mrs. Voss, he said, before this goes any further, we need to discuss what is best for the company. Lillian closed the report. Then she looked at the badge beside her husband's photograph. No, she said. Now we discuss who this company has been best for. The oldest board member was named Harold Benton, and he had the tired confidence of a man who had survived many storms by calling them weather. He placed both hands on the back of a chair. Mrs. Voss, no one here wants to dismiss your concerns, but public conflict can damage trust. Lillian looked at the employees gathered beyond the glass. Trust with whom? Harold paused. With partners, investors, the public. And what about the people already inside the building? No one answered. That was how Lillian knew the answers had been missing for years. Clara stood near the head of the table, her face controlled again. This company employs over 2,000 people. One emotional morning cannot dictate structural decisions. One emotional morning did not create these records, Lillian said. She touched Naomi's packet. One emotional morning did not write Tasha's notes. She touched the folded pages from the lunch bag. One emotional morning did not edit complaints, silence witnesses, or teach reception to measure human worth at the door. Then she placed her hand on the brass badge. And one emotional morning did not build this company. Daniel looked at the badge and then at the floor. Lillian turned to the board. I own 51% of Voss Meridian. I have allowed others to speak for this company while I grieved. That ends today. Clara's eyes narrowed. Lillian continued. Effective immediately, Clara Whitmore is suspended pending an independent review of complaint handling, employee treatment, and visitor access practices. Harold straightened. Mrs. Voss, that requires procedure. I know the procedure. My attorney drafted the authority letter in that folder. You will find it signed, dated, and delivered. Daniel closed his eyes, not in fear this time, but relief. For years, he had waited for someone stronger to interrupt the machine. Now that someone had come in a wheelchair, wearing a damp cardigan, carrying an old badge everyone else had forgotten, Lillian looked at him. Daniel, you will cooperate fully with the review. You will not soften language. You will not protect reputations at the expense of truth. Yes, Mom, he said. And after today, no complaint will be renamed to make the company more comfortable. Naomi's shoulders shook once. Lillian turned to her. Naomi Brooks, you risked your position to tell the truth. That risk should never have been necessary. Until the review is complete, you will report directly to the Independent Ethics Council, not to anyone in this chain of command. Naomi could barely speak. Thank you, Mrs. Voss. No, Lillian said gently. Thank you for refusing to let silence do the company's paperwork. A few employees behind the glass wiped their eyes. Then Lillian looked at Tasha. Tasha Bell, you kept records when the system failed you. I would like you to serve on a temporary dignity council with staff from facilities, patient access, security, reception, and human resources. Tasha stared at her. Me? Yes, especially you. Tasha looked down at her work shoes, still damp at the edges from the morning rain. I clean rooms, Mrs. Voss. Lillian's expression softened. Then you know what people leave behind. That sentence broke something open in the room. Tasha pressed one hand to her mouth, then nodded. Isaiah stood near the door, eyes wet but steady. Lillian turned to him next. Mr. Reed. Yes, Mom. You spoke when it cost you something. I will not forget that. Isaiah lowered his head. I should have spoken sooner. So should many people in this room. The words were not cruel. That made them harder to escape. Finally, Lillian looked at Marissa. The receptionist sat very still. Her perfect posture had collapsed into something smaller, more human. The woman who had guarded the lobby like a throne now looked like someone who had discovered the floor beneath her was thin. Miss Vale, Lillian said, you will be removed from front desk duties pending review. Marissa nodded, tears slipping now. I understand. You will be required to participate in restorative accountability with the employees and visitors you harmed if they choose to attend. You will receive training, but training is not forgiveness. It is only the beginning of responsibility. Marissa wiped her face with the back of her hand. I am sorry, she whispered. Lillian looked at her for a long moment. I believe we're sorry now. Marissa flinched because the now was honest. Lillian continued, do not waste that sorrow by using it only to feel better about yourself. Let it change how you see people when they have nothing to offer you. Marissa bowed her head. Clara said nothing. Perhaps she had finally understood that the room no longer belonged to her language. The board members spoke quietly among themselves, but no one challenged Lillian again. Not because they had suddenly become brave, because proof had entered the room with witnesses, records, and a woman who had stopped hiding from her own authority. Later that afternoon, the footage from the lobby was preserved. The edited complaints were locked for review. An outside counsel was contacted before 5 o'clock. By evening, every employee received a message from Lillian Voss. It did not sound like corporate language. It sounded like a person returning home to find the lights still on, but the house in need of repair. The message said that dignity would no longer depend on title, clothing, accent, disability, race, age, job, or appointment status. It said the company had failed people. It said repair would begin with truth. And at the bottom, Lillian added one line that made Naomi sit at her desk and cry. Never make people beg to be seen. 2 weeks later, the photograph of Eli and Lillian was returned to the main hallway. Not hidden near the executive floor, not tucked beside a private conference room. It was placed near the entrance where every employee, visitor, cleaner, courier, patient advocate, investor, and receptionist would pass it. Beside it was a small display case. Inside lay the brass badge, Lillian Voss, co-founder. Beneath the badge was a simple note written in Lillian's own words. This company does not become greater by making people feel small. On the day the display was installed, Lillian returned to the lobby. The rain was gone. Sunlight came through the glass doors and spread across the marble in bright squares. Isaiah saw her first and opened the door before the automatic sensor could. "Good morning, Mrs. Voss. Good morning, Mr. Reed." Tasha came down from the service's hallway, wiping her hands on a towel. Naomi arrived with a folder full of council notes. Daniel followed behind them, quieter than before, but no longer hiding behind speed and schedules. For a moment, Lillian sat in the center of the lobby and listened. Shows on marble, elevator chimes, phones ringing, people greeting one another by name. Not perfectly. No building heals in a day. But something had shifted. The room had learned to look lower, slower, closer. Marissa was not at the front desk. Her nameplate was gone. But 3 months later, after review, apology, and difficult meetings she did not run from, she accepted a temporary role in record support away from public reception. It was not a reward. It was a chance to rebuild from the side of the desk where humility could find her. One afternoon, she passed Lillian near the hallway display. She stopped. "I used to think power was being the person who decides who gets in," Marissa said. Lillian looked at the badge behind the glass. "And now?" Marissa swallowed. "Now I think power is making sure the door does not teach people shame." Lillian nodded once. "That is a better beginning. Not forgiveness in full, not yet, but a beginning. Months later, employees still told the story of the morning. A receptionist mocked a black woman in a wheelchair, and a manager ran out shouting that she owned 51% of the company. But the people who understood the story best knew the ownership was not the miracle. The miracle was not that Lillian had power. The miracle was that after being humiliated, she did not use power to humiliate back. She used it to make the room safer for the next person who came in tired, wet from the rain, carrying pain no badge could explain. And maybe that is what dignity really is, not demanding that the world clap when you enter, not proving your worth to those committed to misunderstanding you, but remembering who you are so clearly that even when someone treats you like you do not belong, you do not hand them the pen to write your name smaller. If this story reminded you of someone who carried quiet strength while the world underestimated them, share their name in the comments. And stay with Hush Stories for more stories about dignity, truth, and the people who rise without losing their heart.